Gina and I were thrilled to kick this program off with Deepak Chopra back in January. And we're just as thrilled tonight to have Marianne Williamson, who I have the privilege to introduce. She's someone who's, if you haven't read them, she's had 6 New York Times bestsellers. She's running for Congress in District 33. And so, you know, this whole mind, body, spirit, I've been involved with the Aspen Institute since we did our first seminar with Charlie Firestone back in 1991. And I was intrigued with mind, body, spirit. Most people around town think of it as nurturing the whole person. For Gina and I, it's about harmony and using that harmony to have a clearer picture of the world and of reality and hopefully better decisions which better reflect your own intent. But the mind-body program, as we have here, is something that is very core to the Aspen Institute, as is another Aspen Institute phrase, which we call the Aspen motto, thought leading to action. This is one that is the core to all of our global leadership seminars and our public policy programs. And there was a quote from our speaker tonight that I think kind of reflects that idea of thought leading to action and also how important mind, body, spirit is. Marianne had said, "You may believe that you're responsible for what you do, but not for what you think. The truth is that you're responsible for what you think because it is only at this level that you exercise choice. What you do comes from what you think." Over a half century ago, another person, Mahatma Gandhi, said something just as powerful. He said, "Your beliefs become your thoughts become your words, and your words become your actions." These two statements reflect the values of the Aspen Institute, the Aspen idea, and the Aspen motto. Another quote that she had, which I think sort of takes us to where we want to go with all of our leadership programs, she said, "Personal transformation can and does have global effects. As where we go, so goes the world, and for the world is in us. The revolution that will save the world is ultimately a personal one." So, without further ado, Marianne Williamson.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I've always wanted to speak at the Aspen Institute. I always felt like the cool kids spoke at the Aspen Institute. So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. It's been just wonderful being here today. The wonderful people, Julie Bergman, Gina Murdoch. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, so many people. Laura Welch and Lexi Potemkin had me. We had a fundraising luncheon today for my congressional campaign. So Aspen, I even have relatives live here. So Aspen, I've really experienced. I'd experienced the beauty of Aspen before, but I had never experienced this special warmth, and I understand the magic in a whole new way. So good on you, Aspen. Thank you for sharing that with me this weekend. This day, not a weekend. So let's talk about where we are as a planet, where we are as people, and particularly where we are as spiritual communities. This is a Mind, Body, Spirit series, so we can talk within the context of people who are interested in personal transformation. You know, I was talking to a young man the other day, and he was talking to me about all these millennial activists, these very young people who have all this political activism that they're bringing into a connection with their spirituality. And this young man was saying to me, you know, we think what we're bringing, what my generation is bringing, is this spiritual dimension. And I said, well, every generation thinks that they invented all the great stuff. Every generation, that's part of being young. When we're young, we think we have the new idea. And really, it's not so much about new ideas, it's about new containers and new iterations of eternal ideas. But particularly this idea of spirituality and politics, it's important for us to know. I think in order for us to act most powerfully, it's important to know that this is so not something new. Jerry mentioned Mahatma Gandhi before, and I want to go back actually to the founding of our country. You know, back in England, before America was even founded, before the colonies were even much at all, certainly not independent yet, they had a law, and that law was that if an aristocrat's carriage came by, that everyone who was not an aristocrat would have to bow before them. And there was a man named William Penn. And when the aristocrat's carriage came by, William Penn did not bow. And the carriage went by, and a guard with a long sword came up to William Penn and said, "Excuse me, why did you not bow? Did you not see that an aristocrat's carriage just passed by?" Excuse me. William Penn said, "My religion forbids me to bow before any other man." And William Penn was a Quaker. And George III, as we know, of England at that time, had a way of sabotaging himself, you might say. That's nothing new. I'm sorry, I have asthma. And it's obviously acting up, I'm so sorry. Anyway, King George, in order to get William Penn out of his hair, gave him some land in America and told him to just go away. And that, of course, became Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania, where the Quakers, along with William Penn, were so concentrated on staying in their spiritual center. And so much of American democracy emerged from that. Later on, the abolitionists were the foundation stone for the Quakers, were the cornerstone of and the foundation of the abolitionist movement. I read a book not long ago, Sue Monk Kidd's new book. And Sue Monk Kidd's new book is called The Invention of Wings. She's the one who wrote The Secret Life of Bees. And this book is really fascinating. They were called the Grimke sisters, and they were two of the leading abolitionists. One of them actually wrote the first feminist manifesto. But they were born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. They were born into a slave-owning family, and what that book explained in a way that I'd never thought about before. First of all, before reading that book, I hadn't realized, well, I just hadn't thought about how many Southern abolitionists there were. And there were quite a few Southern abolitionists. But what that book brought into clear view in such an amazing way is what it would have been like to be a Southerner who awakened to the evils of slavery. So these are these little girls who are playing with these little black children thinking they're their best friends. And the awakening, what that would mean to recognize she's not just my friend, she's my slave. My mommy gave her to me on my birthday. She's not just my friend, she's my owner. And the phases that people would have to go through emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, of realization, this is evil. This is my house. This is my mommy and daddy. If I don't like it, I'm repudiated. I mean, the extraordinary levels of understanding and realization and ultimately courage that it would take to become that. You know, years ago, I visited Kibera. Anybody here been to Kibera, the slum in Nairobi? It is one of the most vast slums of the world. You know, we have over a billion people, called the bottom billion on the planet, who live on $1.25 a day. And Kibera is a very, very small portion of land that has many people on it, beyond what you and I could even imagine. And I remember watching a little boy who was standing on a bridge overlooking the creek, but all the creek is sewage. And he was about 8 years old, maybe 10 years old. And I remember wondering, I wonder if he's realized where he is yet. I wonder if it has occurred to him that these are his situations, that this is his condition. Anyway, what I learned from that book, well, I had learned about the Quakers before, but what was clear to me from reading that book was how much has to go on inside before it is born outside in terms of political and social change. We know that when a woman has a baby, she's first pregnant with the baby. But it is also true with any vast social movement, all that goes on inside people. So there was a lot of time before what we know of as the abolitionist movement, what had to go on inside people before something then burst forth into manifestation as a social movement. And much of it emerged from the Quakers, because the Quakers sit in silence. And the Quakers believe that there is an inner light within every man, woman, and child. And that's why William Penn was not supposed to bow before any other man. And out of their silence, if anybody here has ever been to a Quaker meeting, just sitting in silence and knowing the truth of the heart and hearing the guidance of the heart. And then the abolitionists became the foundation stone for the Quaker, the Quakers became the abolitionists' cornerstone. The same happened with women's suffrage in the United States. It was the Quakers that were the foundation of what became the women's suffrage movement. And then, of course, the civil rights movement in the United States also emerged, obviously, from a preacher named Martin Luther King in Atlanta and the Southern Christian Leadership Council. So not only has spirituality and the spiritual communities of the United States never been separate from the great political and social narrative of our country, quite the opposite. Spiritual communities have been the foundations of every great social justice movement in the United States. Now, that is extremely important, because a lot of people, and I've been very involved, obviously, with this community for 30 years, but a lot of people who have been involved with spirituality and personal transformation over the last few decades, the way it is unfolded over the last 2 decades or so in the United States is with this weird thought, this thought that I'm too spiritual to be involved in something as unconscious as politics. But I would like to submit to you, you can't be selectively conscious. You can't be selectively awake. You can't say, I'm conscious about this, I'm conscious about that, but I'm not conscious about that. Why? Because I don't really want to look at that. Well, that's a convenient excuse, isn't it? But I'll tell you something, there is no serious spiritual path on this planet that gives anybody a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. In the Course in Miracles, it talks about how you can't bring the light to the darkness. You have to bring the darkness to the light. You can't just pour pink paint over your own neuroses, pretend they don't exist. No, anybody involved in personal transformation, spirituality, recovery, anything like that, knows that we have to admit our character defects. We have to look at our own shadows. We have to atone for our errors. We have to make the commitment to course correct. And when we do that, then a crisis turns into an opportunity. But the crisis does not turn into an opportunity until and unless we do that real inner inquiry. Who am I really? Am I even who I say I am? Do I stand on my own first principles? What are my shadows? What are my mistakes? Where do I have to atone? Where do I have to make changes? Well, that's true not only of an individual, but it's true of a collective. It's true of a nation. It's true of a species. All that a nation and species are a collection of people. So a country, for instance, has its own secrets. You know, they say in AA that a person is as sick as their secrets. So is a country. So if a country, for instance, like in the United States, we have the second highest child poverty rate, second only to Romania. We have the highest mass incarceration rate. Now, what does this have to do with personal transformation? People who are personally transformed do not allow that. That's what it has to do with it. People who are personally transformed know not only, and this is where the abolitionist movement came from. This is where the women's suffrage movement came from. This is where the civil rights movement came from. It came from people who sat within their own internal center, and they had 2 powers going for them. It gave them moral authority. Number 1, they found the conditions that were morally unacceptable, and they found the possibility of what could be imminently feasible. That's what spirituality gives you. In the Christian context, it's the shift from the crucifixion to the resurrection. In the Jewish context, it's the shift from the slavery in Egypt to deliverance to the promised land. It's that period of time. It's that transition. That's what the transformation is. The transformation of a condition of bondage a condition of the bondage of the spirit, the bondage of a people. It's no different whether it's my own personal bondage or the bondage of people, whether it's the slaves in Egypt or it's the slavery to our own false appetites. You know, it's interesting. You never hear a Christian say, I'm not going to go to Easter this year because I know the story. And you never hear a Jew say, I'm not going to go to Passover this year. I know what happens. I know the story. The story does not change, but we change. In that, we become people whose energy either supports the condition of the crucifixion and slavery or supports the condition of the resurrection and deliverance. But it's all the same archetype. And it is the same thing going on, whether it's one person or whether it's a collective going through it. You know, a lot of times people who are traditional Christians, we have our own judgment. Sometimes people say to me, I can't stand the traditional Christians sometimes. And I say, well, why? And they say, they're so judgmental. But one of the things that is true of our crowd, as true of anyone else, is that we too selectively read the Bible. And in the New Testament, there's the story of Armageddon. And the metaphysical types, we don't like to go into Armageddon. We don't read that part, right? But I'd like to talk about the story of Armageddon from a metaphysical perspective. So some of our more traditional, certainly born-again Christian friends would say about the Armageddon that there is going to be one huge global catastrophe. It's going to be one huge global war. And after that, the forces of goodness and light will prevail, and there will be 1,000 years of peace. Well, this is what the metaphysical, esoteric reading of that would be. Or not. But how would that occur? How would we take the option, the or not? It would be this. You realize, you know, it's like a person who finally gets it about Easter, finally gets it about the crucifixion, finally gets it about slavery in Egypt. Oh, I get it, that was my divorce. Oh, I get it, that was my getting sober. Oh, I get it, that was my cancer diagnosis. Oh, I get it, that was the death of my loved one. In other words, our personal Armageddons. That which takes us to our knees. That which breaks us open. That which in our own personal lives is the place where the dysfunctional, negative, self-sabotaging, destructive energies seem to do a battle with the goodness and the harmony and the love and the light within us. And ultimately love prevailed. Ultimately love prevailed. And what happened after love prevailed? You became wise. So these are our two choices, ladies and gentlemen. You can take your Armageddon, go through it, transform because of it, and become a wise person. You've gone through your own personal Armageddons. You've crashed in your own way. You've transformed. And on the other side, you become wiser. You've gone through your own personal Armageddons, your own stuff, broke through and become wiser. Not perfect necessarily, but wiser. So this is our choice. We can take your being wise and your being wise and your being wise and my being wise and all of us being wise, enough of us at a critical mass level that we bypass Armageddon as a global catastrophe. That's our only choice here. Either we are going to become wise and act wisely, or our born-again Christian friends probably have something. Just like with a person, as the Course in Miracles says, it's not up to you what you learn. It's merely up to you whether you learn through joy or through pain. So when Jerry said it's a difference between moving from thought into action, you know, I was fortunate because when I began my career 30 years ago, I began speaking on A Course in Miracles in Los Angeles just about the time. Within a year or two after I started lecturing, the AIDS crisis burst onto the scene. So my career was never separate from an experience of being very up close and personal with human suffering. And human suffering of a group of people and a group response. When this, niche, this cultural mainstream impulse of enlightened and transformative thought began to emerge, something odd happened. That it became so centered on self. And even though we must do the work of personal transformation, because as Gandhi said, the end is inherent in the means. Everything we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. We cannot ultimately manifest what we ourselves have not become. But if we're only looking to ourselves in terms of transformation, if we're only thinking about my bondage rather than our bondage, It's not the story of the transformation of the universe. It's not just about my transformation, it's about our transformation. And so when it comes to transformational principles, I have felt for a long time that those of us who are involved in this larger impulse of how we, our own lives, can transition from crisis to opportunity, from weakness to strength, from lack to abundance, from fear to love, from pain to peace. We are the last people who should be sitting out the larger global political and social questions, because if you have an idea what changes one life, you're the one who has a clue as to what changes the world. That's so important. So when people have said to me, I don't want to be involved in politics because politics is so unconscious, my thought about that is, if those of us who are involved in the higher consciousness community, the higher consciousness conversation, do not put that conversation into the political realm, how can we complain it's not there? That was our job. So there's a way in which we ourselves, I think, have been withholding our contribution. And that is what made abolition abolish slavery. That is what brought the women's suffrage movement to the point of passing the 19th Amendment. That is what brought the civil rights movement to the point of actually, through civil rights legislation, completely ending legalized segregation and Jim Crow laws in the American South. And that is exactly what Jerry was talking about when it moves from thought into action. The Course in Miracles, like all the great spiritual paths, talks about how what we think then determines what we do. And I believe when it comes, here I am talking in Aspen. I know that this is a community that totally, God knows, we've been all reading the same books for a long time. We've been all listening to the same tapes for a long time. Ladies and gentlemen, the era of data collection is over. I mean, enough. And that's true in all our lives, of course. You know it. But what next? You know, in A Course in Miracles, it says enlightenment begins as abstract concept. It's just something up here. And then it makes a journey without distance, from the head to the heart to the gut. It becomes visceral. And I think in all of our lives, there comes a point when if we follow our own internal guidance, you know, sometimes people say, well, I don't know what God is telling me. I don't know what God is telling me. When at least half the time you know what God's telling you, you just don't like what God is telling you. You're not comfortable with what you're hearing, but you hear it. Do you really not hear it? Well, I hear it, but I think it must be wrong. I think I should ask next week, because I think if he has more of the facts, as I do, I'm sure he will change his mind. I don't think so. I don't think so. And so just as every cell in the body has a natural guidance system. There's a blueprint by which the embryo becomes a baby. There's a blueprint by which the bud becomes the blossom. There's a blueprint by which the acorn becomes an oak tree. It's already in there. The difference between us, within whom there is a blueprint by which we become the highest manifestation of our most creative potential. We are programmed to rise to the highest of our own creative manifest potential in this lifetime, and there's a blueprint by which my having risen to my highest and you having risen to your highest and you having risen to your highest synergistically all rise higher than any of us could do alone. Now the only difference between us and the embryo is that we can say no. It's the only difference. So there's that programming by which the embryo becomes the baby. Now, not only does all that cell division occur, and a brain comes into being, and a heart comes into being, and liver comes into being, and a spleen comes into being, and bones come into being, and blood comes into being. Nature doesn't even stop at the birth of the baby. Your heart continues to beat, and your lungs continue to breathe, and all these extraordinary physical processes continue, because every cell is guided what to do. And some cells are assigned to the liver, and some cells are assigned to the bones, and some cells are assigned to the heart, and some cells are assigned to the blood. They are all internally guided. Every cell has an internal guidance system by which it is sent to collaborate with other cells in order to foster the healthy functioning of the whole. Every once in a while, a cell goes insane. It disconnects from its natural guidance system, and it says, no, I don't want to. I don't want to collaborate with other cells to serve the healthy functioning of the liver. I want to go off and do my own thing. And I'm going to get other 6 cells to come be around me who only want to do their own thing. We're going to have our own kingdom over here. What is that called? Cancer. It is a malignancy When any cell forgets that it's here to collaborate with the other cells to foster the healthy functioning of the whole and goes off just to do its own thing, that is a malignant thought. And that kind of malignant thinking has come to prevail within the human race. There's a part in the Course in Miracles where it says, do not look to yourself to find yourself, because you're not there. That's not where you exist in totality. We exist in relationship. We exist in relationship. So what has happened, and the ego, the insidious fear mind will use anything, even spiritual principle, all twisted up, as to use almost even a spirituality as an excuse for making it just about me. It's like, once I get really enlightened, I'm going to serve the world. There is so not time for us to get all enlightened. And I don't think there's anybody in this room who doesn't know that. I think now we're all feeling that yearning. We're all feeling it. We're all feeling like, surely there must be a part I can play. And like somebody was telling me the other day that the trend of the moment, he said, among people he knows is from success to significance. Okay, that's one way to put it. The idea that we all know that we want to feel we were used. We want to feel like we were used for some purpose higher than ourselves. We are programmed that way. The embryo is yearning to become the baby. The bud is yearning to become the blossom. The acorn is yearning to become the oak tree. The flower yearns. It leans towards the sunlight. And each and every one of us leans towards the possibility that we could be all that we can be. That is our deepest yearning. In the Jewish book of wisdom called the Talmud, it says that over every blade of grass, there's an angel bent over saying, grow. Grow, grow. And we've all heard the line also, which is, how sad is he who dies never having sung his song. And so we have been pregnant for a long time. We have been pregnant. You become pregnant, a woman at a certain age becomes pregnant with a child sometimes. But there are many ways to be pregnant. And all of us, whether we are women of childbearing age or not, are pregnant with the next best version of ourselves. And now our world is pregnant with a new possibility. And one of the reasons we're pregnant with a new possibility is because the old one is completely unsustainable. Do you know how a chicken knows it's time to peck its way out of the eggshell and be born? Do you ever wonder about that? How does a chicken know? I never thought about this until I read about this. How does a little chickie know it's time to start pecking its way out of the eggshell? You know how? When it's time for the chicken to hatch, a toxic gas fills the inside of the eggshell. It is literally dying to be born. It's like, I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here. We are born, and any woman who is giving birth, she's pregnant. Yeah, you gestate first, just like the American people gestated the abolitionist movement, gestated the women's suffrage movement, gestated the civil rights movement. These things happen inside, and then they are born into the world. And much has been gestating within us. Much has been gestating within us at our time. And any woman who's ever been pregnant and given birth knows, on one hand, you can't wait for this baby to be born, because this is it's like, get this out of me. And on the other hand, there's some little level of terror. And it's messy, and it won't all feel good. But it is the way of nature. Martin Luther King said, if you don't have a cause worth dying for, you don't have a life worth living. And he said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about the things that matter. It's really wonderful for all of us that we have places like the Aspen Institute. But we need to be real clear about this also. You can't really change the world over white wine and brie. And there's a limit to what we can do from the sidelines. And there's a limit to what we can do from online petitions. And there's a limit to what we can do when we stay with the ultimately easy thing of talking about it, just talking about it some more. And that's why Jerry said that the crux and the essence of the Aspen Institute is that we know and now we must do. I'm not saying we ever stop the process of figuring it out, trying to improve ourselves. But the world cannot wait for us to become enlightened masters. At a certain point, we are good enough. And what concerns me about this country if you look at the extraordinary heroism of the abolitionists and the extraordinary heroism of the women suffragettes, if any of you have never seen it, see the old HBO special called Iron-Jawed Angels. Too many American women don't know that history. And of course, the Civil War, the Ken Burns, I mean, there are many ways to see about that. The Civil Rights Movement. This is so rich. It's like knowing your own personal history. When you know your own personal history, you know where you fit in. Who's your mommy? Who's your daddy? You know where you fit in. And you know where you need to stand on their shoulders. And my mommy was such and such, and my daddy was such and such. And I'm going to extend this beautiful thing that they brought into the world. And this is where my daddy was broken, and this is where my mommy was broken. And in those places, it's my job to break the chain so that my children do not inherit it. But we do the same thing with our country. We must do the same thing with our country. We must do the same thing with our species. What comes from the past that's good and we want to improve upon it? Their heroism, their courage, their magnificence, and where do they have some real neurotic patterns that we need to break right now? To see ourselves within the larger story, and it is a magnificent story of this country. It is a magnificent story. And when you look at what happened, there was slavery here. Slavery, abject slavery. But a generation rose up, and they did what had to be done to stop it. Women were not even allowed to vote. A generation rose up, and they did what needed to be done to stop it. There was legalized segregation in the American South. A generation rose up, and they did what it needed to happen to stop it. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be the first generation of Americans to wimp out on the job of making this country all that it can be, because if we are honest with ourselves, the threats to the democratic franchise today in this country, mainly from the over-influence of moneyed forces and the shrinking of our civil liberties, the expanding influence of corporations and domestic surveillance, make us a generation confronted with a challenge as great as any generation before us to stand up for our country and course correct. And to me, it gives me such great sense of strength and belonging to know all that change that happened from the abolitionists came because of Quakers. That moral force exerted by spiritual community, and the moral force exerted by the spiritual community that gave rise to the suffragette movement, and the moral force that gave rise to the civil rights community. So we are so right on time and right on track. So much so. So much so. And there is a destiny here. Just as every person, every cell is programmed to be all that it can be, and every person is programmed to be all that we can be by some invisible force, I think every nation is programmed to be all that it can be. But every nation, in order to be all that it can be, the individual cells, i.e. the citizens, have to self-actualize to our greatest extent and collaborate with others. That's why liberty matters. That's why democracy matters, because it is the best container we've come up with so far for the self-actualization of the individual. And that matters. You know, there's a lot of work. I saw it in the hallway here at the Aspen Institute. There are a lot of people these days who are very active in global citizenship, very active in global issues, global poverty, global issues of women. We're really onto it about global, aren't we? And it's a beautiful thing, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be. And if you think I'm going to say now we have to face, but we have those problems here at home, that's not what I'm going to say. But I am saying this. We're in denial if we think that there is no ultimate answer about those fundamental global issues until we get the United States government back to its conscience and its ethics and its democratic center. And when we do that, because when the United States gets it right, we are a light unto the nations. We have been. You know, with a country, it's just like with an individual. You know how you have good friends or therapists, or every time you're talking about how great you are, there's either a therapist or a friend to remind you didn't do everything right? But it's also important to have a therapist or a good friend to remind you when you're talking about, oh my God, I messed up, I messed up. It's so important for there to be somebody in your life to say, you didn't do everything wrong, okay? And I think a country's just like a person. We haven't done everything right, but we haven't done everything wrong either. And it's our time to do just what we do in our families. Where have we gotten it right, and where is it our job now as stewards of democracy and stewards of our country in our time to add to that, to continue that, to build on that, and bequeath it to our children even better than what we found. How hot and magnificent is that? And where do we get it wrong? Where is our country getting it wrong? What are our own shadows? What are our own defects? And where is it our job to course correct from that? That's a big job. But the reason it's so exciting for me talking about that here at the Mind, Body, Spirit Conference is because it has never been done that way in the United States except through the auspices of the spiritual communities of their time. And I feel very strongly that it's not going to be any different this time. Those who think that people who are into the spiritual things, you know, it's just like we're not quite real with what's going down. Well, let me tell you something. What is the message of the Spirit? Spirituality is simply the path of the heart, from fear to love. That's all that spirituality is a movement into love. And we think love should be the bottom line. But if love should be the bottom line, it shouldn't just be the bottom line in my life. It should be the bottom line in economics. It should be the bottom line in society. There are people who say that that's so naive. There are people who would say, that is so naive. To think that love should be the bottom line in international relationships. Love should be the bottom line in domestic policies. Love should be the policies in economics. Oh, that's so naive. Well, let me tell you what I think, ladies and gentlemen. To think we can exist, we can continue to thrive as a human civilization for another 200 years if we do not do that is naive. That's what's naive. That's what's naive. So the way I see it is you and I have been pregnant for a long time. The spiritual community in this country, we've been pregnant, we've been good. We've been reading books and writing books, and we've been listening to tapes, and we've been going through our own personal transformation. We've been in recovery, we've been in psychotherapy, we've been in spirituality, we've been in practice, we've been meditating, we've been praying, and we have changed. Maybe we're not, I always say, maybe I'm not Jesus yet, I'm not some master yet, but I'm way different than how I used to be, and that's really good news. That's it, we're good enough, And then you say, okay, let's put it all together. Some of the wisdom that you have, you bring the wisdom you have, you bring the wisdom you have, you bring the wisdom you have, I'll bring the wisdom I have. And where you're not wise, I'll compensate with my wisdom. And where I'm not wise, you'll compensate with your wisdom. And you'll bring your understanding of how the media could be uplifting. You'll bring your wisdom about how education could be uplifted. You'll bring your education about how politics could be uplifted. You'll bring your education and your upliftment and your wisdom about how business could be uplifted. And each and every one of us will bring what we can, and we will collaborate, and together we will do something beautiful. That is the vision. That is the possibility. And this is what those who are not imbued yet with a spiritual understanding don't get. And I do think if you're not grieving at the state of this planet today, you're not looking. But on the other hand, if you're not rejoicing in how different it could all be, then you're not yet seeing through to infinite possibility. And that is what the spiritual life gives us. Not only an absolute intolerance for what we know in our hearts is wrong, but it also gives us the knowledge that through the grace of God, this could all change. And what is possible is imminently feasible. Ladies and gentlemen, the spiritual community is not somebody to just sit in the background and kind of be spectators. We always have been, and we need to be now, leaders in the transformation of this world. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's very sweet of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Gina, did I take too much time, or is there time for a few questions? What do you want to do? Yeah? Okay. We can talk about it. I'm sorry. I love that in a man. Okay. We can talk about anything you want to talk about. Just raise your hand. I think somebody's coming to you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You've inspired so many of us for so many years.
Thank you.
As we look at equal human rights for the future, do you believe that another frontier is freeing those who love someone of the same gender?
Of course, and the whole, the whole idea of, see, this country, the story of this country, we were born of a profound dichotomy. On one hand, embedded in our founding documents were the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all, and the idea that power was given by God to all, and that all should be able to experience the blessings of liberty. Many of the men, however, who wrote those things were themselves slave owners. And of course, they didn't mean women either. So women were not to be owned as slaves were, so I'm not putting a moral equivalence there. But the point is that that tension has always been there. And the narrative of American history, generation after generation, the journey of our country has been those who would do whatever necessary to make sure that we actually made that manifest and expanded the democratic franchise, so that it didn't just mean white men, landowners, so that it also meant people of color, so that it also meant women, etc. And now this is simply the next stage in our journey. That's all that's going on. That marriage equality is just one more, we mean everyone. And that's the democratic process. And in every generation, there are those who would do what they could and needed to be done to expand that manifestation, and there have been those who resisted it. And so absolutely, once again, the marriage equality is part of that larger narrative. We don't just mean this group, we mean everyone. We don't just mean this group, we mean everyone. We don't just mean this group, we mean everyone. And marriage equality is absolutely part of that. And what's so beautiful, of course, is that young people are being, coming up now who can't even understand why this is even an issue. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I got a kick out of when you said we've all read all the books, done the same psychotherapy, and I'm right with you. And I was wondering, what if you have some suggestions that some of us lay people can actually do to make a difference?
What do you mean lay?
People that are not in politics.
Well, okay, now that's the problem right there. That's the problem right there. Excuse me, this country is ours. That means we're all in politics. That's what's happened. It's inside our minds. We have allowed ourselves to be enthralled by the idea that there's some people are in politics and some aren't. Even President Eisenhower said politics should be the part-time profession of every American. The word politics comes from a Latin root, politea. It doesn't mean of the government, it means of the people. And what has happened in this country is that we, the citizenship, we've become disengaged. And right now, there's like a thief stealing democracy, but we left the doors open and we left the windows open. Too many of us, by a kind of disengagement where, it has been a manipulated thing by which it's become a spectator sport. And a kind of political class is running things. That's a problem. You can call that a lot of things. It's not democracy. So we have to ask ourselves seriously what we want. Because if you only have a few people who consider themselves, quote unquote, in politics. Many years ago I lived in a big house. And several people lived there. This was in the 1970s in San Francisco. And, I had my bedroom and somebody else had their bedroom and somebody else had their bedroom. And God knows there was a lot going on in a lot of those bedrooms, a lot of those lives. However, when it came to what are we going to do about the roof? What are we going to do about the break in the driveway? What are we going to do about, the fact that, they pick up the garbage on Wednesday? We had to have a house meeting. And that's what politics should be. There are the things that really just about you and your business, and you and your business, and you and your business, and some things are about our business. And if we leave it into the hands of what we could consider a political class, you can call that a lot of things, but it's not democracy. And so we must disenthrall ourselves of that worldview. And by the way, the very things we least like, the forces that would seek to forge those dynamics, are absolutely invested in our remaining disengaged. They just love it. Does that make sense? So it all begins, but where does it begin? An awakening. Just an awakening. It all begins inside with personal transformation, doesn't it? The other day we were having a conversation, and there was this case that came to the Supreme Court in 2010 called the Citizens United case, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it. Some people, I'm one of them, many people feel it will go down in history as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever in our country's history. And you know, we should be audacious as Americans. We should feel free to say it as it is. I'm not a radical person, but American democracy is radical. So I'll say it. We have some hacks, total political hacks on the Supreme Court of the United States. That's okay to say. This is America. These people were not put there by our founders to lord over us. So this is the deal. So there's a decision that basically perverts democracy because it gives unlimited permission to moneyed forces, wherever they come from, to flood campaign election seasons, issues campaigns, which is almost guaranteed to elevate some candidates and denigrate others. Now, why do I mention this? Because I was saying at this meeting that there's one even worse than that about to come down the pike, and it's called the McCutcheon case. And the McCutcheon decision, we don't know how the Supreme Court will decide. It could be any day now. We don't know how they'll decide. But if they decide along the same line of corporatism that they decided with the Citizens United case, then McCutcheon will actually make it worse because it will take off all caps for political giving, even to candidates. So, I mean, forget it. Those with money will make the decisions and no one else will have a voice, period. Now, this is what it's like. It's like a soap opera. You're sick one day, you're staying home, and you're completely bored. And you turn on television and you see that there's a soap opera. And you go, I don't even watch soap operas. I don't know who these people are and I don't know what they're doing. And you turn it off. The next day you're still sick, you have the flu, you can't go out, you turn on TV. And the same people, and you're not watching it, you don't watch soap operas, and all of a sudden you say, oh, she's pregnant with his baby. And then the next day you find yourself turning it on. Oh my gosh, she's his sister, or whatever. Right? So you're totally hooked. And that's how it is with politics. Your eyes glaze, you don't even read it. And then something happens. So what I was saying to this group of people about the McCutcheon case, you've now heard me talk about it. And you might even be thinking, oh my God, why do I have to talk about this? This isn't spiritual. Right? But this week, you'll open the paper and something will be there and you'll go McCutcheon, you'll see McCutcheon. And because we talked about it, you're going to notice it. You're no longer asleep to the issue. Does that make sense? So it all begins with personal conversation and personal awakening. You know, there are people in this world who roll their eyes about Americans. Other people just roll their eyes about us. They just can't believe how almost proudly disengaged we are and how almost proudly obsessed we are with ultimately meaningless things. They just can't believe sometimes how distracted we are from huge problems, not only in the world, but in our own country. But those same people, and a lot of us know this, those same people who roll their eyes about how disengaged Americans are the first ones to acknowledge that when we do wake up, we slam it like nobody's business. You know, Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. Right? And when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, a Japanese admiral very famously said, I fear we have awakened a sleeping bear. So, sleeping giant. Some people say it was bear, some people say a sleeping giant. But so, once again, it's the internal awakening. It's an internal awakening that precedes the kind of activism that is necessary. So sometimes it's this, you know, we heal. We all know this from our own personal lives. We heal one aha at a time, don't we? It's like one book or one thing somebody says or one you go, right. And then the next time you encounter that topic, it's never quite the same because you had that insight. Who's next? Did that answer your question? What the layperson? You'll never call yourself a layperson again. You're an American woman, got that? And you don't tolerate bullshit on this planet.
Hi, thank you so much. So what do you have to say to, because I've read a lot of these same books too, what do you say to a lot of these spiritual teachers, metaphysical teachers that will say, don't read the paper, don't watch the news. Energetically, it brings us negative energy. Because I feel like there's a conflict there. So what's your message?
Look, don't look at the fact you have cancer. Just don't look at it, okay? Just don't even look at it. Look, your kids are on heroin. Don't look at it, okay? Whatever you do, don't look at it. It'll just give you negative energy. Your house is burning down, but don't look at it. There's nothing unholy or unspiritual about yelling fire if in fact the house is burning down. Now let me ask you a question. If somebody in this room, God forbid, keeled over, very quickly we would all become mature, sober adults in 10 seconds. And Jerry would probably stand up and say, okay, we're talking about everybody but the doctors. If there are any doctors or nurses here, please stay in this room. Everybody else, please get out. Somebody call 911. I mean, we would all just get so grown up so fast. Wouldn't we? If we saw one person suffering, maybe they had a heart attack or something, we wouldn't know. We would all just immediately become adults. We wouldn't say, it's all illusion. It's all just an illusion, and it's just a dream. Let's continue with where we are. And look, I write books about those illusions. I understand the concept, but it's a very selective reading of that source material. The point is not to ignore the illusion. The point is to transform the illusion, to bring the light into it. So that's what I say. Now, in terms of some of the most famous of the spiritual teachers out there, behind closed doors, they're more radical than me. I'm not radical, though. I just feel like American democracy is radical. It's a radical idea. Love each other. Love one another. It was a radical concept. It was a radical concept 2,000 years ago. It's a radical concept now. Of the people, by the people, for the people. It was a radical concept when Lincoln said it at that Gettysburg battlefield. And he, of course, was just basing that on the Constitution of the United States from 1776. It was radical then, it's radical now. But it's important that we understand its radicalism. It's important that we embrace what it means of the people, by the people, for the people. Because at moments like this, when we are confronted by a government of a few of the people, for a few of the people, by a few of the people, we would then say, I don't think that's what we're supposed to be. I remember years ago when we were kids, and we would cross our hearts and say the Pledge of Allegiance and say, one nation under God, liberty and justice for all. And I remember when I was a young woman and I said to somebody, why don't we say the Pledge of Allegiance in school anymore? And my friend said, because it's all bullshit, man. We're not liberty and justice for all. And I said, but the fact that I swore that we were supposed to be is what makes me notice that we're not. Right? If I hadn't sworn in my heart, one nation under God, liberty and justice for all, I don't think I'd be so upset when I see obvious injustice. I don't think I'd be so upset because I'm like, as a child, I was like, no, that's what we're supposed to be. Does that make sense? So there's something much bigger going on here than you getting yours or you getting yours or me getting mine. There's something much bigger, and that has to do with our stewarding something truly magnificent on this planet. Does that make sense? Yes, who's next? Yes, ma'am, over there. Oh, yes, sir. I'm sorry, ma'am.
Howdy.
Thank you.
I've always been curious about thought generation.
The thought generation?
Yeah, what comes before
yes.
The thought. And I spent some time with Chopra, and he said his opinion was the space between our thoughts is who we really are. I've never had that thought countered. So if you have any counter thoughts to that, I'd be curious. But also,
I would not say that I have a counter thought, but I do have a context for that might be something that you enjoy. I certainly do. The Course in Miracles says we are thoughts. We ourselves are ideas. God is an idea, and we are thoughts in the mind of God. So that thought in the mind of God, according to the Course in Miracles, is the thought of love. So what you are saying would absolutely be correct if it's thought with a little t. That who we really are is what happens in between our thoughts. But in a larger metaphysical sense, who we really are is the large thought with a capital T that exists behind all these thoughts with a little t that are just the caca of the mortal mind. Does that make sense? So beneath those thoughts, behind those thoughts is reality, which is itself a thought, but the thought of the mind of God.
How do we, as a people, influence the thought generation of other people?
From a Course in Miracles perspective, our job is not to influence anyone else. Our job is to become the best that we can be. And that our job is not to monitor anyone else's. God doesn't give me guidance for your life. God doesn't give you the guidance for my life. We have a 24-hour-a-day job just monitoring our own thoughts. And if I'm not liking your thought and thinking you need to change your thought, obviously I'm in my ego mind and not my pure thought if I see anything wrong with you at all. So if I think you need to change, I need to change my thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And especially from a spiritual perspective, when you think how much evil has been perpetrated on this planet, and how much evil is perpetrated on this planet, even today, by those who think, I understand how God works. And if only they did, we'd be okay. So thoughts of spirit, don't think that our crowd is invulnerable to thoughts of spiritual superiority. Right? And I think that's so important. If we're looking for our own shadows, as we've been talking about today, looking at our own shadows as individuals, and we've been talking about looking at our own shadows as a nation, but that's also our community too. And that's a good thing. It's called health, mental health, maturity. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Boy, you're really going to hear. Thank you, Marianne, so much. You speak beautifully, and we all wish you the very best in this. So we think this way. We appreciate your being here and what you're doing, and that's why we're here. When you talk about if I think somebody else should change, then I have to look at myself. How about the people, the powers that be, that are just greedy? It's about money. It's about power. It's fear-induced. They think they're fine. They don't see a problem. They know it's a messy world, but they don't think it lies within them. So spirituality without coercion, what are the action steps?
That's a very important question. First of all, this is America, and people get to think and act however they wish, as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. Our problem is not fighting or resisting people who might have thought forms, such as those you mentioned, that we don't like. That's not why we're in trouble in the world. We're in trouble because we're not harnessing the power of all the people who do agree with us. That's the problem. We are decent people. We are compassionate people. Martin Luther King said, the American people are far more compassionate than the U.S. government. The problem is not that there are people in this country who think only in terms of greed is good, me getting mine is best, basically a few people controlling everything would be better for everybody. The problem is not that they exist. They have a right to exist. The problem is that they have so much political power based on the fact that we become a legalized system of bribery and corruption because money buys government the way it does today. So when you ask what we do, everybody has to answer that question for themselves. I know for myself, what I feel strongly is that we need to get the money out of politics, and that's the greatest moral challenge of our generation. Because until we do that... So, it's very important that we be impeccable with our own spirituality. The problem is not that those people exist, and the problem is not that they have those opinions. The problem is that they have an undue influence on our government. So this is not about demonizing individuals, it's about holding systems accountable. We have to always be vigilant about monitoring where we're coming from. Otherwise, we just lower into the same thought forms that are the problem. Because if we're thinking they have no right, well, is that any different than they're saying we have no right? They do have a right, but if democracy was in charge, the money would not have the right. Yes, sir. Did you?
I attended your luncheon today, and I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And you changed my perspective on one aspect of money in politics. Yes. I've been inundated by requests for money for women, candidates all over the United States, and they all seem to be wonderful and marvelous. But I keep thinking to myself, gee, I'm going to give money to this Florida candidate who seems like a wonderful person, but shouldn't the Florida people be giving money to her? and not everybody in the whole world, you know. So attending your meeting, I looked at you and I said, well, gee, I'm not in her district, but I'd certainly like to see her successful. So I'm going to donate.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And you're right. I'm sorry.
It's the people's house.
It is the people's house. That's right. That's what the founders called the House of Representatives. And, you know, I'm sure many of us have given to Elizabeth Warren, even though we don't live in Massachusetts, or to Bernie Sanders, even though we don't live in Vermont, or whatever. So absolutely, when it comes to the federal government, you're supporting candidates is important. It's not like a state or local, because they're part of the national conversation. And thank you very much. I'm honored by that.
I
Yes.
have one important question I really
Okay.
want to ask. I'd like to hear from you. Why did you choose to run for Congress in the 33rd District in California?
Well,
Why you?
You know, it's what we're talking about here tonight. Each of us has our own internal guidance system. And when I was saying earlier, you know, sometimes we say, I don't know what God is telling me to do, and really, if we're honest with ourselves, yes, we do. We just don't like what God is telling us to do. Who among us can honestly say that's not true? I mean, and when this is why meditation matters. Because each and every one of us has a direct radio link to the voice for God. The problem is that living in the world today, there's too much static, and so it's not coming through. The voice is there. That's why we quiet the mind. That's why mindfulness, that's why meditation, that's why prayer, and so forth. It's so that we begin to feel that we have a sense of guidance. And my guidance none of us are special, and all of us are special. The guidance to run for political office is no better and no worse than the guidance to do anything else. The Course in Miracles says that we are all have, you know, infinite potential to save the world. You know, this idea of specialness, we want to get rid of that. And one of the things about democracy that's beautiful is no specialness. We're all equally important, and we're all infinitely important. But I am trained as a Course in Miracles student about listening. And for me, in this particular issue, it was a year of very serious inquiry with my family, with my friends, and inside my own heart. And I ultimately realized it was an itch that was not going away. It was a mosquito in my ear that I couldn't get rid of. And my daughter was, oh, Mommy, why would you risk that? People are so nice to you now. People like people, you know, everything's nice. You have a nice life. You know, why would you risk that? And what I really fear is risking 75 and feeling like I missed out on doing everything I could possibly do. And I also want to speak to this issue. A lot of people have said to me, oh, Marianne, you're so brave, you're so courageous. I really think American women need to lift the bar on what we think is courageous. Okay? Thank you very much. Courageous is a woman who has been told she can't go out of her house without a male relative. She has to be covered in an entire burqa from head to toe. And if she is caught without the male relative, and if she's even caught without, you know, like one woman in Afghanistan who reached out for a peach in the market and her burqa fell down to here and she was lashed. Let me tell you something.